The quiet enters before the cold does. That's the first contrast many Americans notice when they cross into Canada, an atmospheric shift so subtle it's almost hard to name. Streets move with purpose but without urgency. Conversations carry warmth but not volume. Even city noise seems wrapped in a soft layer of restraint, as if the entire country has collectively agreed to keep the world at a gentler frequency. It feels familiar in structure, yet distinctly calmer in tone, echoing the observations that Canadian public life often feels unusually peaceful and balanced. Even in major cities, for Americans accustomed to a cultural landscape defined by energy, motion, and assertiveness, this quiet can land as its own kind of shock. First impressions tend to form quickly: the softer voices in cafes, the measured rhythm of traffic, the absence of heated public arguments. People hold doors longer, wait their turn without impatience, and keep their emotions contained in a way that feels almost ceremonial. The experience often parallels what many describe when noticing that Canadian streets, transit systems, and public spaces lack the tension and vigilance they're used to back home, creating an atmosphere of ease that can feel unfamiliar, even surreal. As these impressions deepen, the contrast begins revealing a set of cultural values stitched quietly into daily life. Canadians often view harmony as something worth preserving. Politeness operates less as etiquette and more as emotional infrastructure, an instinctive form of social maintenance that softens friction before it ever fully forms. Where Americans are shaped by directness and expressive communication, Canadians lean toward restraint, subtlety, and consideration. Each soft-spoken greeting, each unhurried cue, reflects an understanding that collective comfort matters just as much as personal expression. Many Americans interpret this as an unusual calm, a cultural commitment to balance that becomes noticeable in everything from public behavior to the rhythm of conversation. Daily interactions reinforce the pattern. Buses move without raised voices. Sidewalks fill with people who glide instead of rush. In a crowded cafe, murmurs replace chatter. These aren't dramatic scenes, but symbolic gestures woven into routine. Drivers wave others through intersections not out of obligation but out of instinct. Shoppers stand patiently in checkout lines without sighing or glancing at the clock. Even disagreements occur at a lower emotional register, shaped by a national tendency to avoid unnecessary escalation. For many Americans, these moments begin to illustrate a broader cultural habit of moderation, one where public life is guided by steadiness rather than intensity. Over time, the quiet Americans notice in Canada stops feeling like silence and starts feeling like structure. It becomes clear that the softness in public life isn't an absence of energy, but the presence of a deeply rooted social agreement. This agreement shows up in the way people move through shared spaces calmly, predictably, without the undercurrent of urgency that defines so much of American urban life. Many Americans describe a moment, often within days of arrival, when they realize they aren't bracing for sudden conflict, loud interruption, or abrupt chaos. The emotional vigilance they carried from home begins to loosen, replaced by a rhythm that rewards patience rather than speed. That shift speaks to a cultural difference in how each society interprets space and autonomy. In the United States, the public environment is often navigated with a strong sense of individual momentum, people carving paths, asserting presence, moving decisively. In Canada, the emphasis leans the other way. People tend to adjust to one another, creating collective flow instead of individual trajectories. Public restraint isn't seen as suppression, it's regarded as courtesy. Even in large cities, where density might suggest noise and friction, movement remains surprisingly deliberate. Observations of this kind echo the experiences Americans share about Canadian streets, where calmness and order appear not as exceptions but as norms built into daily behavior. Anecdotal patterns reveal themselves in countless small moments. On trains, riders speak softly, keeping their conversations contained. In grocery stores, lines move in steady silence, each person giving the next just a little more space than expected. Even in winter, as cities brace against freezing temperatures, interactions remain measured, neighbors helping one another shovel snow, drivers slowing to wave pedestrians across icy roads, communities responding to storms with cooperation rather than frustration. These aren't dramatic displays of unity but quiet, symbolic gestures that shape the emotional climate of the country. They resemble the countless observations of Canadians instinctively merging politeness with practicality, especially during harsh winter routines that demand both cooperation and patience. Gradually, many Americans begin to sense how these habits influence the broader emotional environment. The quiet doesn't create loneliness. It creates room. Instead of feeling watched, people feel respected. Instead of competition, they sense coordination. The absence of public tension creates a kind of mental spaciousness, one that allows individuals to navigate daily life without the background hum of defensive awareness. This softening is often tied to the sense of safety Americans report in Canadian cities, where trust in public systems and in one another reduces the subconscious vigilance many bring from the U.S. The result is a cultural exhale, a lifting of invisible weight that reshapes how they interpret ordinary moments as the weeks turn into months. The quiet that once startled many Americans begins to influence how they think, act, and interpret the world around them. What initially felt like a muted version of North America slowly reveals itself as a different emotional ecosystem, one shaped by trust, restraint, and a cultural preference for stability over spectacle. The longer someone stays, the more they notice how conversations unfold at a gentler volume, how disagreements resolve without edge, how public life feels cohesive instead of competitive. In this environment, the absence of constant tension becomes its own form of communication, signaling that people expect safety, cooperation, and respect as default conditions rather than privileges. Observations of Canadians trusting their systems, their institutions, and each other reinforce this shift, showing how these expectations create a social fabric that feels unusually secure to American newcomers. These changes produce a quiet transformation. Many Americans find themselves adjusting their tone without thinking, speaking more softly in cafes, stepping aside more readily on sidewalks, apologizing reflexively in crowded spaces. The instinct to rush begins to fade. The habit of scanning every environment for danger loosens. Public life begins to feel less like navigation and more like participation. Even emotional expression shifts. Assertiveness softens into consideration, urgency dissolves into patience. This process mirrors the subtle ways Americans in Canada start mirroring local habits, thanking bus drivers, queuing without frustration, adopting the understated politeness that once felt foreign but now feels natural. What emerges is a broader reevaluation of what daily peace looks like. Many Americans realize they were accustomed to a louder emotional climate, one where public assertiveness, rapid movement, and heightened vigilance shaped every day. In Canada, that climate quiets. People trust that strangers won't escalate conflicts, that institutions will support them, that communities will step in when needed. This trust filters into everything from late-night walks to interactions with neighbors, reshaping the psychological baseline of life. For Americans, especially those from high-intensity cities, this can feel revelatory. They begin recognizing how much of their identity was shaped by the noise and pressure they assumed were normal. The contrast highlights how emotional environments can sculpt a person's sense of safety, belonging, and even self-awareness. By the time this cultural shift settles in, the quiet no longer feels empty. It feels intentional. It becomes a backdrop that allows small human gestures, politeness, cooperation, steadiness to take center stage. Many Americans describe the experience as gaining clarity about what they carry from home: the speed, the constant readiness. Canada does not erase these traits, but it gently softens them, offering an alternate model of how society can move, speak, and coexist. In that contrast lies the deeper lesson: quiet is not a lack of life but a different way of living it. And experiencing that difference reveals how profoundly cultural rhythms shape emotional well-being. It leaves many with a final thought, one less about Canada itself and more about what happens when a society chooses calm over noise, cooperation over assertion, and trust over fear. The shock isn't simply that Canada feels quiet. It's that the quiet changes people. It becomes a mirror, reflecting how life might feel if emotional volume weren't a constant companion. And once someone has lived in that gentler rhythm, it becomes impossible not to wonder how different their own world could be if quiet weren't the exception, but the norm.